The year was 1891, and autumn had settled over northern England like a shroud. Jonathan Hargrove stood at the iron gates of his ancestral estate, watching rust flakes fall like dead leaves onto the cobblestones beneath his feet. 23 years had passed since he'd last seen these grounds, and the mansion before him seemed to have aged decades in his absence. The Hargrove estate stretched across the Yorkshire moors like a wound in the earth. Its Gothic spires pierced the grey October sky, while ivy crawled up its walls like grasping fingers. Windows stared down at Jonathan with the hollow gaze of a skull, many of them boarded shut, others cracked and weeping with condensation. This was his inheritance, a monument to decay, and a family he'd spent half his life trying to forget. Jonathan's carriage driver, a weathered man from the village, refused to take him any closer. "This is as far as I go, sir," he muttered, crossing himself. "You'll have to walk the rest." The man's eyes never met Jonathan's as he spoke, and his hands trembled as he unloaded the single trunk that contained everything Jonathan owned. The gravel drive crunched beneath Jonathan's boots as he approached the manor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very ground was trying to pull him down into its depths. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents of mildew, rotting wood, and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him of flowers left too long on a grave. Mrs. Ashcombe was waiting for him at the front doors. The elderly caretaker looked as weathered as the mansion itself, her grey hair pulled back severely, her black dress hanging loose on her gaunt frame. She'd served the Hargrove family for longer than Jonathan had been alive, tending to an empty house and keeping its secrets. "Master Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't certain you would come." "Neither was I," Jonathan replied, studying the woman's lined face. There was something in her eyes, relief, perhaps, but also a deep sadness that seemed carved into her very bones. She led him through halls that echoed with their footsteps. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. Portrait after portrait of long-dead Hargroves watched from the walls, their painted eyes following Jonathan's progress through rooms that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "The villagers," Jonathan said as they walked. "They seemed... I was afraid when I mentioned the family name." Mrs. Ashcombe's step faltered slightly. "The Hargroves have never been popular in these parts, sir. There have been misfortunes over the years." Misfortunes. The word was too small for what Jonathan remembered hearing in whispered conversations, fragments of stories that followed him even after he'd left for London. Siblings who died young of mysterious illnesses. Daughters who vanished on moonless nights. Sons who threw themselves from the manor's highest tower, their bodies found broken on the stones below. They passed the great staircase, its banister carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. To their left, a corridor stretched toward the manor's east wing, but heavy chains and a rusted padlock barred the way. "What's in there?" Jonathan asked, though something in his chest already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "The sealed wing, sir. It's been closed for decades. Your grandfather's orders, and your father kept it so." Mrs. Ashcombe's voice grew even quieter. "Best to leave some things undisturbed." But Jonathan found his gaze drawn to that darkened corridor, pulled by a compulsion he couldn't name. The air near the chains seemed colder, and he could swear he heard something, a sound like fingernails scratching against wood, or perhaps just the old house settling. Mrs. Ashcombe showed him to his father's old study, a room lined with books whose leather bindings had cracked with age. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface covered with a thick layer of dust. Behind it, tall windows looked out onto the estate's grounds, where dead trees reached toward the sky like skeletal hands. "I'll leave you to settle in, sir," Mrs. Ashcombe said. "Dinner will be ready at 7. Though I must warn you, the house makes noises at night. Old timbers, settling foundations, nothing more." After she left, Jonathan stood alone in the study, surrounded by the weight of generations. He ran his fingers along the desk's surface, disturbing the dust, and felt something beneath, a slight depression, as though something had been hidden there. In the bottom drawer, behind a false back, Jonathan found a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. His father's handwriting filled the columns, documenting not money or property, but something far more sinister. Dates stretching back years, paired with single-word entries: Thomas, Margaret, Catherine, names of family members, each followed by a notation that made Jonathan's blood run cold. "The debt continues," read one entry. "The offering must be maintained." Another, "The hunger grows restless. Payment overdue." On the final page, in his father's increasingly shaky hand, the bloodline weakens. "Soon only Jonathan remains. God forgive us for what we have sown." Jonathan's hands trembled as he closed the ledger. Outside, night was falling over the Yorkshire moors, and the wind through the broken shutters sounded almost like voices, hungry voices, calling his name. As he sat there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the sins of his ancestors, Jonathan felt the terrible weight of understanding begin to settle upon his shoulders. He was not just the last heir to the Hargrove fortune. He was the final payment on a debt that had been accumulating interest for generations. The question that would haunt him, and should haunt us all, was simple yet terrible. What price had his family agreed to pay, and what happens when the final payment comes due? Sleep came fitfully to Jonathan that first night, filled with dreams of shadows that moved without light to cast them. He woke before dawn with the taste of copper in his mouth, and the sound of his own name echoing in his ears. The ledger lay on his nightstand where he'd left it, but in the grey morning light, he almost convinced himself it had been a nightmare. Almost. After a breakfast of stale bread and bitter tea, Jonathan returned to his father's study with grim determination. If he was to understand what had been done in his family's name, he needed to dig deeper into the Hargrove history. The study shelves held more than books. Hidden behind volumes of poetry and philosophy, he found boxes of documents that chronicled his family's rise from obscurity. The earliest records dated to 1687, when Elias Hargrove had been nothing more than a miller's apprentice in the village below. England was suffering through one of its worst famines in memory. Crops had failed across the north, and people were dying in the streets. Yet somehow, inexplicably, Elias Hargrove's mill continued to produce flour when others had long since ground their last grain. Jonathan spread the documents across the desk, his fingers tracing the faded ink. There were bills of sale showing Elias purchasing land at impossibly low prices from desperate families, property deeds signed by men who would die within weeks of the transactions, business contracts that made no sense. How could a simple miller suddenly afford to buy out his competitors during the worst economic crisis in generations? A diary, written in Elias's careful script, provided more disturbing details. "The harvest blessing worked beyond my wildest hopes," read one entry from October 1687. "The grain stores fill while others starve. Magistrate Thornfield questions my methods, but his questions will not last long." 3 days later, another entry. "Thornfield found dead in his chambers. The doctor claims it was his heart, but I know better. The compact protects its own." Jonathan's blood chilled as he read on. Entry after entry detailed the mysterious deaths of anyone who questioned Elias's sudden prosperity, business rivals who sickened and died, officials who suffered tragic accidents, neighbors who simply vanished without trace. But it was a letter from Elias to an unknown correspondent that made Jonathan's hands shake. The paper was different from the rest. Older, yellowed to the point of brittleness, and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "My benefactor," the letter began. "The first offering has been made as agreed. My youngest son, Thomas, was taken in the night. His mother believes it was a fever, but you and I know the truth. The mill prospers, the lands expand, and the Hargrove name rises. Yet I find myself wondering if the price demanded is not too steep. How many more must feed the hunger before our debt is satisfied?" The response was written in a different hand entirely, script so archaic that Jonathan struggled to read it. The compact is eternal. Elias Hargrove. What grows in darkness must be fed by darkness. Your bloodline has accepted this burden. There is no escape, only the choice of willing compliance or inevitable consumption. Jonathan pushed back from the desk, his breath coming in short gasps. The study felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward like the sides of a coffin. He stumbled to the window, desperate for fresh air, but the view beyond offered no comfort. The estate grounds stretched away into morning mist, and somewhere in that grey expanse lay the graves of all those who had paid the price for the Hargrove prosperity. More documents revealed the pattern that had repeated for 2 centuries. Each generation of Hargroves had prospered beyond reason, their wealth growing even as England suffered through wars, plagues, and economic collapse. But prosperity came with a cost. Children who died young, spouses who vanished, family members who took their own lives rather than face whatever dwelt beneath the estate. Jonathan found architectural plans from various periods, showing how the manor had been rebuilt and expanded over the years. But there were inconsistencies, spaces that didn't appear on the official blueprints, rooms that seemed to exist only in the builder's private notes. And beneath it all, a network of tunnels and chambers that extended deep into the earth, like the roots of some monstrous tree. As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan's research painted an increasingly horrifying picture. His ancestor Elias hadn't simply made a deal with the devil. He'd invited something far older and hungrier into the world, something that had been feeding on the Hargrove bloodline for over 200 years. The final document in the collection was an architectural survey from 1823, commissioned by Jonathan's great-grandfather. The surveyor's notes were clinical and professional until the very end, where the handwriting devolved into terrified scrawls. The foundations go deeper than any building should require. The lower chambers predate the manor by centuries, possibly millennia. Whatever sleeps beneath this house, it was here long before the Hargroves. They didn't create it, they simply learned to feed it. That night, as Jonathan lay in his childhood bedroom, he felt eyes watching him from the shadows. The house creaked and groaned around him, but underneath those familiar sounds was something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against stone, coming from somewhere far below. When sleep finally took him, his dreams were filled with a figure standing at the foot of his bed, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that held the depth of centuries. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound emerged until Jonathan heard the whisper that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The debt remains unpaid. Last son of Hargrove, hunger waits, and it grows tired of waiting. Jonathan woke to find scratches on his bedroom door, 4 parallel lines gouged deep into the wood, too high to have been made by any animal. Mrs. Ashcombe, when questioned, claimed they had always been there, but her eyes couldn't see him as she spoke. Determined to understand the true extent of his family's sins, Jonathan began a systematic exploration of the manor. The servants' quarters yielded old household records detailing the comings and goings of family members over the decades. But it was in the nursery wing on the manor's 3rd floor that he made his most disturbing discovery. The rooms had been abandoned for years, yet they remained perfectly preserved, as though waiting for children who would never return. Dust sheets covered small furniture, but beneath them, Jonathan found remnants of young lives cut short, wooden toys carved with loving detail, their paint faded, but their craftsmanship unmistakable. Miniature soldiers arranged in battle formations that would never be completed. Dolls with porcelain faces and empty glass eyes that seemed to follow his movement through the room. In a chest beneath one of the windows, Jonathan discovered a collection that made his blood run cold. Locks of hair, carefully braided and pressed between the pages of children's books. Each lock was labeled with a name and date. Catherine Hargrove, age 7, taken 1798. William Hargrove, age 5, taken 1834. Margaret Hargrove, age 9, taken 1856. The word taken appeared with each entry. Never died or past taken, as though these children had been collected like tithes to some terrible god. Sketches filled the margins of the books. Drawn in a child's uncertain hand, most depicted the manor and its grounds, but others showed darker scenes, figures gathering in underground chambers, strange symbols carved into stone walls, and in one particularly disturbing image, what appeared to be children walking hand in hand down a tunnel that disappeared into absolute darkness. Jonathan called for Mrs. Ashcombe, his voice echoing through the empty halls. When she appeared, her face went pale at the sight of the items spread across the nursery floor. "You shouldn't be up here, Master Jonathan," she whispered. "This wing holds too much sorrow." "Tell me about the children," Jonathan demanded. "Tell me what really happened to them." Mrs. Ashcombe's hands twisted in her apron, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the windows. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I was just a girl then, working in the kitchens. But the servants talked as servants do. They said the Hargrove children weren't dying of illness or accident. They said they were being offered to something that lived beneath the house, something that demanded tribute." "Offered?" Jonathan's voice was sharp. "You mean sacrificed?" "I don't know the proper word for it," Mrs. Ashcombe replied, tears beginning to flow down her weathered cheeks. "I only know that children would go to sleep in their beds and never wake up. But their bodies were never found. Not in the house, not on the grounds. They simply vanished, as though they'd never existed at all." She led him to another room, where a child's bed remained perfectly made despite decades of abandonment. The pillow still bore the impression of a small head, and when Jonathan touched it, the fabric was inexplicably warm. "This was little Thomas's room," Mrs. Ashcombe explained. "He was the last taken just before I came to work here. His mother searched for him for months, walking the grounds day and night, calling his name. She finally threw herself from the tower, rather than accept that he was gone." Jonathan studied the room more carefully, running his hands along the walls. Behind a loose section of wainscoting, he found more evidence of the children's fate. A hand-drawn map showing the layout of the manor's lower levels. Childish handwriting labeled various chambers: the singing room, the place of whispers, the hungry dark, and at the very bottom of the map, drawn in shaking letters, the words "They're still down there." That evening, as Jonathan sat in the study trying to process what he'd learned, the house began to speak. Soft scratchings came from within the walls, too rhythmic to be mice or settling timber. The sounds moved from room to room, following no pattern he could discern, until they seemed to converge directly beneath his feet. He pressed his ear to the floor, and heard something that made his heart race. The faint sound of children's voices, singing a lullaby he remembered from his own childhood. The melody was mournful and sweet, but underneath it was something else, a pleading quality that spoke of centuries of longing. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a single voice calling his name, "Jonathan. Come play with us, Jonathan." He jerked away from the floor, his heart pounding, but the voice continued, now seeming to come from the walls themselves. "We've been waiting so long, so very long, won't you come down and play?" Jonathan understood then that his exploration of the sealed wing could not be delayed. Whatever had taken the Hargrove children was still there, still hungry, still waiting, and it knew he had returned. As he prepared for bed, Jonathan found a final note tucked into the pages of one of the children's books. The paper was fresh, the ink still wet, though no living child had been in these rooms for decades. "Uncle Jonathan, we know you're here. We can feel your footsteps above us. Please don't forget us like the others did. Please come find us before hunger takes you too." The note was signed with a dozen names, all Hargrove children, all supposedly dead for decades. But if they were dead, how could they still be calling his name? And if they were alive, what had they become during their long imprisonment in the darkness below? The chains across the entrance to the sealed wing felt cold beneath Jonathan's hands, but they gave way with surprising ease, as though they had been waiting for him to break them. The padlock, rusted with age, crumbled at his touch like an ancient bone. Behind the barrier, darkness stretched away into the depths of the manor's eastern wing, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him of incense burned at funeral services. Jonathan's lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls as he stepped across the threshold. The sealed wing felt different from the rest of the manor, older, heavier, as though the very air was thick with centuries of accumulated sin. Dust lay undisturbed on the floor, except for a set of small footprints that seemed to lead deeper into the darkness. The first room he entered had once been a sitting room, but now it resembled nothing so much as a shrine. The walls were covered with crude carvings, circles within circles, symbols that hurt to look at directly, and names, so many names. Every Hargrove who had ever lived in the manor was represented, their names carved deep into the plaster and wood. But alongside each name was a date, and beside each date, a single word taken, offered, or consumed. Jonathan's own name was there too, carved in fresh wood at the very bottom of the wall. No date accompanied it yet, but someone or something had already marked him for inclusion in this terrible catalogue. Moving deeper into the wing, Jonathan discovered rooms that defied explanation. A dining room where the table was set for dozens of guests, the plates filled with what appeared to be children's toys instead of food. A library where every book had been hollowed out and filled with locks of hair, arranged by color and texture. A music room where a piano played itself, the keys depressing with spectral fingers to produce a melody that sounded like a funeral dirge played backwards. But it was the nursery that made Jonathan's sanity teeter on the edge of collapse. The room was pristine, as though it had been cleaned and maintained daily despite decades of abandonment. A small bed sat in the center, its covers turned back as though waiting for a child to climb in. Toys were arranged with obsessive precision on shelves that lined the walls, wooden horses, tin soldiers and dolls whose glass eyes seemed to track Jonathan's movement through the room. On the bed lay a child's nightgown, pressed and folded with care. When Jonathan lifted it, he found it was still warm and damp with what might have been tears. Beneath it, pressed into the mattress, was the clear impression of a small body. "You found us." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a child's whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Jonathan spun around, his lamp throwing wild shadows across the room, but he was alone. "We've been waiting for you, Uncle Jonathan." "Waiting so long." More voices joined the first, a chorus of children speaking in unison, their words overlapping until they became a harmony of longing and despair. "The grown-ups forgot us, but we never forgot them. We remember everything. Every promise broken, every sacrifice made, every soul fed to the hunger." Jonathan's hands shook as he held his lamp higher, trying to pierce the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. "Who are you? What are you?" "We are the payment," the voices replied. "The price for prosperity. The children who went into the dark so that the Hargrove name could flourish in the light." A letter lay on the bedside table, written in a woman's delicate script. As Jonathan read it, he recognized his Aunt Margaret's handwriting, though the words were those of someone descending into madness. "The rituals grow worse each night. Father brings us to the chamber beneath the foundations, where that thing waits in its pit of bones. It speaks to us in voices of the dead, promising power, demanding payment. My brothers and sisters disappear one by one, and each morning Father pretends nothing has happened, but I can hear them crying in the walls, calling for help that will never come. I tried to tell Mother, but she only smiles and says, we must trust in Father's wisdom. God help us all." I think she knows. I think she's always known. The letter ended abruptly, the final words trailing off as though Margaret had been interrupted mid-sentence. At the bottom of the page, written in a different hand entirely, were the words "She joined us in the end. They always do." As Jonathan read, the temperature in the room began to drop. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. The toys on the shelves began to move, subtle at first, just a slight shifting of position, but then more pronounced. The wooden horses rocked on their bases, the tin soldiers marched in place, and the dolls turned their heads to stare at him with glassy, unblinking eyes. "Don't be afraid," the children's voices whispered. "We're not angry with you. You didn't choose this. But the debt must be paid, Uncle Jonathan. Hunger has waited so long, grown so patiently, but patience has its limits." The door behind Jonathan slammed shut with a sound like thunder. When he tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. The wood had somehow fused together, as though it had never been separate pieces at all. He was trapped in this nursery of the damned, surrounded by voices of children who should have been dead for decades. "Come with us," they pleaded. "Come down to where we wait. It's not so bad once you accept it. Hunger is almost kind in its way. It preserves what it takes, keeps us whole, keeps us together. We're a family now, Uncle Jonathan. A real family." The lamp in Jonathan's hand began to flicker, its flame dancing wildly despite the absence of any wind. In the wavering light, he caught glimpses of movement in the corners of the room, small shapes that might have been children, but wrong somehow, distorted by their long imprisonment in the darkness below. "The passage is behind the wardrobe," the voices said, growing more excited. "Father carved it himself, a secret way down to the feeding chambers. We can show you the way. We can introduce you to the others, generations of Hargroves who paid the price for earthly prosperity." As if moved by invisible hands, the wardrobe began to slide aside, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone and something far worse, the cloying sweetness of decay that had been building for centuries. "Come down, Uncle Jonathan," the children called, their voices now coming from the staircase itself. "Come see what we've become. Come see what you will become. Hunger is waiting, and it's so very, very hungry." Jonathan realized then that his exploration of the manor's secrets had been orchestrated from the beginning. Every door he'd opened, every document he'd found, every revelation about his family's dark history, it had all been leading him to this moment, to this choice. He could flee, try to escape the manor, and leave its secrets buried. Or he could descend those stairs and finally learn the truth about what lay beneath the Hargrove estate. The children's voices grew softer, more pleading. "Please don't leave us alone again. Please don't abandon us like all the others did." And despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Jonathan felt his feet carrying him toward the staircase. After all, he was a Hargrove, and Hargroves always paid their debts. The descent into darkness felt like falling through centuries of accumulated sin. Jonathan's lamp cast its flickering light on stone walls that wept with moisture, and each step downward brought a heavier weight of atmosphere that pressed against his chest like a physical thing. The staircase was carved from the living rock beneath the manor, its steps worn smooth by generations of reluctant feet. The children's voices had fallen silent, but their presence remained, whispers at the edge of hearing, soft footsteps that echoed his own, and the occasional glimpse of small shadows dancing just beyond the lamp's reach. The deeper he went, the more the boundaries between past and present seemed to blur. He could smell candle wax and incense, hear the rustle of old clothing, feel the brush of invisible fingers against his face. At the bottom of the stairs, Jonathan found himself in a circular chamber that predated the manor by centuries. The walls were covered with carvings so ancient they seemed to predate human civilization entirely, spirals and angles that suggested geometries that shouldn't exist, symbols that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them. But scattered among these prehistoric markings were newer additions, names, dates, and desperate pleas carved by human hands. It was here that Jonathan discovered the true testament of his ancestors' bargain. Elias Hargrove's journal lay open on a stone pedestal at the chamber's center, its pages preserved by the dry, cold air. But these weren't the sanitized business records Jonathan had found upstairs. These were the ravings of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. The thing beneath the stones is older than England. Read the first entry, dated 1687. Older than Rome, older than the first men who walked these moors. It slept in the darkness for millennia, dreaming hungry dreams until my excavations woke it. I thought I had found Roman ruins, perhaps Saxon foundations. I never imagined I had disturbed something that reminds me of when the world was young. Jonathan read on, his horror growing with each page. Elias described his first contact with the entity, how it had spoken to him in voices of the dead, offering prosperity beyond imagining, in exchange for a simple compact. The Hargrove bloodline would flourish, their wealth would grow, their name would endure. All it asked in return was sustenance, not gold or land, but something far more precious. It feeds on life itself, Elias wrote, not death, but the essence that separates the living from the dead. It showed me the truth, that mortality is merely a boundary, and boundaries can be crossed for those willing to pay the price. My children will live forever, it promised. They will become part of something greater, something eternal. The later entries revealed the full scope of the bargain. Each generation of Hargroves would provide offerings, children, spouses, anyone whose blood carried the family line. In return, the survivors would prosper beyond measure. Their mills would grind grain from empty fields. Their investments would flourish during economic collapse. Their enemies would suffer mysterious fates. But prosperity came with conditions. The family could never leave the estate for long. They could never speak of the compact to outsiders, and they could never stop feeding the thing that dwelt beneath their foundations. Thomas was the first, Elias wrote of his youngest son. He went willingly once I explained the necessity. The creature was gentle with him, almost loving. It showed him wonders in the darkness, cities of shadow, gardens of bone, seas of whispered dreams. He is still there, still Thomas, but transformed into something more beautiful than any mortal child could be. Jonathan's hands shook as he turned the pages. Entry after entry documented the systematic sacrifice of the Hargrove children over the decades. Each offering was described in loving detail, as though Elias was writing love letters to an invisible deity. The creature, which he called only the hunger, seemed to take particular pleasure in collecting the young, preserving them in its underground realm like butterflies pinned to display boards. The hunger grows stronger with each offering. Read an entry from 1703. Its chambers expand, its influence spreads. Sometimes I hear it moving beneath the manor at night, rearranging its collection, admiring its preserved treasures. It promises that one day, when enough Hargrove blood has been spilled, it will emerge from its lair and transform the world above. Until then, we must be patient. We must continue to feed it. But there were signs that Elias's certainty had begun to crack in his later years. The handwriting grew shakier, the entries more desperate. Margaret questions the necessity of the compact. She speaks of breaking the pact, of finding some way to seal the creature back into its slumber. She doesn't understand that there is no escape from such bargains. Hunger has tasted our bloodline, and it will not be denied. Better to serve willingly than to be consumed utterly. The final entry, dated just weeks before Elias's death, was barely legible. It grows tired of waiting. The offerings no longer satisfy as they once did. It speaks of claiming the entire bloodline at once, of ending the slow feast and taking everything at once. I have bought us time with promises of future generations, but time is running short. My descendants must understand, the compact cannot be broken, only fulfilled. When the last Hargrove stands before the hunger, the pact will be complete, and it will finally be free to reshape the world above. As Jonathan read these words, the chamber around him began to change. The carved walls seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the air grew thick with the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. From the shadows at the chamber's edges came a rustling sound, like wind through dead leaves, but he knew it was something far worse. The children's voices returned, but different now, older, stranger, filtered through centuries of unnatural preservation. "He knows, Uncle Jonathan. The hunger knows you've found the truth. It's been waiting for you to come down here, to read the words, to understand what you are." "What am I?" Jonathan whispered. "The last offering," they replied in unison. "The final payment, the key that will unlock the hunger's prison and set it free upon the world." From somewhere deeper in the chamber came a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could be made of darkness and despair. The hunger was stirring, roused by the presence of the final Hargrove heir. Jonathan felt its attention focus on him like the weight of centuries, pressing down until his knees buckled and he fell to the stone floor beside Elias's journal. "Welcome home, last son of my covenant," a voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome to the place where all debts are paid in full." Jonathan fled through the darkness, his lamp casting wild shadows on the ancient stone as he stumbled up the stairs. Behind him he could hear the hunger stirring, not the sound of movement, but the sensation of vast attention turning his way, like the gaze of some enormous eye opening after centuries of sleep. The children's voices followed him, pleading and cajoling by turns, begging him to return, to accept his fate, to join them in their eternal imprisonment. He burst through the nursery into the sealed wing, gasping for air that tasted of dust and decay. The manor around him felt different now, not just old and neglected, but actively malevolent, as though the house itself was complicit in the horrors that dwelt beneath its foundations. Every shadow might hide watching eyes. Every creak of settling timber might be the sound of something stirring in the walls. Jonathan found Mrs. Ashcombe in the kitchen, preparing his evening meal with the same methodical precision she brought to all her tasks. But when she looked up at his wild appearance, her face went pale as parchment. "You went down there," she said. It wasn't a question. "You knew," Jonathan accused, his voice raw from his terrified flight through the darkness. "You've known all along what lives beneath this house." Mrs. Ashcombe set down her knife and turned to face him fully. In the lamplight, her features looked older than her years, carved with lines of worry and sorrow that spoke of decades of keeping terrible secrets. "Yes," she said simply. "I've always known." "Then why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me what I was walking into?" Mrs. Ashcombe's laugh was bitter and dry. "Tell you what, Master Jonathan, that your family built their fortune on the blood of innocence, that something older than civilization sleeps beneath your ancestral home. Would you have believed me?" She moved to the window, gazing out at the moor-shrouded grounds where fog was beginning to rise from the earth like the breath of sleeping giants. "Besides, it wouldn't have mattered. The compact doesn't allow for escape. I learned that lesson long ago." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Ashcombe was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the window glass. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of guilt. "I'm not just a servant, Master Jonathan. I'm family, bastard family, but family, nonetheless." She turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw the same haunted look that stared back at him from the Hargrove portraits in the halls. "My great-grandmother was your great-grandfather's sister, the one who supposedly died of consumption when she was 16. Supposedly. She didn't die, Master Jonathan. She was offered to the hunger, just like all the others. But something went wrong with the ritual. Instead of being consumed entirely, she was changed. The creature sent her back up into the light, but she was no longer entirely human. She could never leave the estate, never bear children that would live past their first breath, never die no matter how much she wished for death's release. Mrs. Ashcombe rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were covered in scars, not the random marks of accident or age, but deliberate cuts arranged in precise patterns. The blood calls to the hunger, Master Jonathan. Every Hargrove descendant, no matter how distant, feels its pull. My great-grandmother tried to end the line by killing herself, but the compact wouldn't let her die. So she did the next best thing. She appointed herself the guardian of the secret, the keeper of the rituals. Rituals? Someone has to maintain the compact, Master Jonathan. Someone has to keep the hunger satisfied while it waits for the final offering. For generations, my family has served yours in the shadows, making small sacrifices to keep the creature dormant. Vagrants who won't be missed. Animals from the village. Sometimes, she paused, her voice breaking. Sometimes children who wander too close to the estate grounds. Jonathan stared at her in horror. You've been feeding it. All these years you've been feeding it. To keep it from taking everything at once. Mrs. Ashcombe's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her weathered cheeks. Do you think I enjoyed it? Do you think any of us chose this fate willingly? We do what we must to prevent something far worse. What could be worse than child murder? The awakening, she whispered. If the hunger is denied for too long, if the compact is broken without fulfillment, it will emerge from its lair and consume everything. Not just the Hargrove bloodline, but everyone. Every soul in England, then Europe, then the world. It showed me the truth in dreams. Master Jonathan, I've seen what happens when entities like this are freed from their restraints. As she spoke, the house around them began to respond to their conversation. Doors creaked open in distant rooms, footsteps echoed through empty halls, and from somewhere deep below came the sound of something large stirring in the darkness. The hunger was listening, and it was not pleased with Mrs. Ashcombe's revelations. It grows impatient, she said, glancing at the ceiling as dust began to rain down from the beams above. The small offerings no longer satisfy it as they once did. It wants what it was promised. The completion of the compact, the final Hargrove heir. Then I'll leave, Jonathan said desperately. I'll go back to London or America, or anywhere far from here. The compact can't be fulfilled if I'm not here to fulfill it. Mrs. Ashcombe shook her head sadly. You can't leave, Master Jonathan. Haven't you felt it? The pull of this place, the way it calls to your blood. The farther you try to go, the stronger the compulsion becomes. Your father learned that lesson when he tried to take your mother and flee to Ireland. The hunger sent its servants after them, shadows that walk in human form, children who died centuries ago but still serve its will. My parents' carriage accident was no accident at all. The hunger reclaimed what belonged to it, and your father learned that there is no escape from such ancient bargains. He brought you back here, raised you on these grounds until you were old enough to understand your fate, then sent you away one final time. Not to save you, but to let you live a normal life for a few years before returning to pay the family debt. The implications hit Jonathan like physical blows. His entire life had been orchestrated by the creature beneath the manor. His education, his work in London, even his decision to return to claim his inheritance. All of it had been part of the hunger's patient design. How long do I have? He asked. Not long, Mrs. Ashcombe replied. It calls to you even now, doesn't it? The pull toward the sealed wing, the compulsion to return to the chamber below. Fight it as long as you can, Master Jonathan, but in the end, the Hargrove blood always answers when the hunger calls. As if summoned by her words, the lights in the kitchen began to flicker. The temperature dropped until their breath misted in the air, and from the walls came the sound of scratching, dozens of small fingernails clawing at the inside of the house itself. It knows we've spoken, Mrs. Ashcombe whispered. It knows I've told you the truth. The scratching grew louder, joined by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the walls. But there was no joy in that laughter, only hunger and anticipation and the terrible patience of something that had waited centuries for this moment. The doors to the kitchen slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and the house settled around them like a trap finally springing closed. Jonathan and Mrs. Ashcombe were alone together in the lamplight, surrounded by walls that pressed inward with each passing moment. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, but it sounded like voices calling his name. The hunger was done with patience. The final phase of the compact was about to begin. The house had become a prison. Every door Jonathan tried led only to walls of solid stone. Every window showed only darkness. Despite the afternoon sun, he could glimpse in thin slivers around the edges of the impossible blackness. The very geometry of the manor seemed to have shifted, rearranging itself to guide him toward one inevitable destination, the sealed wing and the staircase that led down into the hunger's domain. Mrs. Ashcombe had vanished sometime in the night. Jonathan had searched every room he could access, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse, but found only the scent of old flowers and the faint echo of weeping that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. He was alone now with the weight of his family's sins and with the growing certainty that his fate had been sealed the moment he'd set foot on the estate grounds. The children's voices had returned, but they were different now, more urgent, more insistent. They called to him constantly, their words filtering through the floorboards and echoing in the spaces between the walls. "Come down to us, Uncle Jonathan. Come home where you belong. The waiting is almost over." By the third day of his imprisonment, Jonathan could no longer fight the compulsion. His feet carried him through the manor's twisting corridors, without conscious direction, past portraits whose painted eyes tracked his movement, past rooms where furniture rearranged itself when he wasn't looking directly at it. The sealed wing's entrance stood open now, the chains that had once barred it lying in rusted pieces on the floor. The staircase beckoned like the throat of some enormous beast. This time Jonathan descended without hesitation. The lamp in his hand seemed unnecessary. The walls themselves gave off a faint phosphorescent glow, as though they were infused with the essence of all the lives that had been consumed in the chambers below. Each step downward brought clearer whispers, more distinct voices, until he could make out individual words and phrases. "Welcome back, Jonathan. We've been preparing for you. Hunger is so exciting to finally meet you." At the bottom of the stairs, the circular chamber had transformed. What had been empty space during his first visit was now filled with the evidence of centuries of sacrifice. Alcoves lined the walls, each one containing what appeared to be a sleeping child, but these were not corpses. Their chests rose and fell with breath, their eyes moved beneath closed lids, and occasionally one would smile or murmur in their endless dreams. The Hargrove children, preserved for eternity in the hunger's collection. At the chamber's center, where Elias's journal had once rested, now stood a throne carved from what looked like solidified shadow. The air around it rippled with heat distortion, and when Jonathan looked directly at it, his eyes watered and his vision blurred. "Magnificent, isn't it?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the stone itself. Centuries of careful cultivation, generations of patient investment. Your ancestors understood the value of delayed gratification. The hunger manifested slowly, coalescing from the shadows that pooled in the chamber's corners. It had no fixed form. Sometimes it appeared as a tall figure in a tattered coat, sometimes as a writhing mass of darkness punctuated by too many eyes, and sometimes as something that Jonathan's mind simply refused to process. But always, it radiated an intelligence so ancient and alien that standing in its presence felt like drowning in deep water. "You're disappointed," it continued, and Jonathan realized with horror that it was reading his thoughts. "You expected something more dramatic, perhaps. Claws and fangs and the traditional trappings of monstrosity. But I am so much more than your simple fears, last son of Hargrove. I am appetite itself, given form and consciousness. I am the hunger that drives all living things, the need that can never be satisfied." Jonathan tried to speak, to demand answers or hurl accusations, but his voice seemed to have abandoned him. The hunger laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. Questions? Oh, I can see them burning in your mind like candles in the dark. Why your family? Why this elaborate charade spanning centuries? Why not simply take what I wanted from the beginning? The entity moved closer, and with each step the temperature in the chamber dropped further. Jonathan's breath misted in the air, and frost began to form on the walls. Your ancestor Elias was remarkably perceptive for a mortal. He understood that I was not some demon to be bargained with, but a force of nature as inevitable as time itself. When he accidentally freed me from my ancient prison, he didn't beg for his life or try to send me back into the darkness. Instead, he offered me a partnership. Images flashed through Jonathan's mind, not his own memories, but visions projected by the hunger. He saw Elias standing in this very chamber centuries ago, young and desperate and burning with ambition. He saw the moment when mortal man and ancient entity struck their bargain, sealing it with blood and shadow, and the promise of generations yet unborn. I could have consumed your entire bloodline in a single feast. The hunger continued. But where would be the artistry in that? Instead, I chose to savor the experience, to let your family flourish and spread, to build their prosperity on the foundation of our compact. Each generation provided new flavors, new variations on the theme of sacrifice. Your family's success made the final harvest all the sweeter. The children, Jonathan managed to whisper, finding his voice at last. I preserved them, of course. Death is such a waste, all that life energy simply dissipates into nothingness. Instead, I gathered them into my collection, where they dream beautiful dreams and wait for the day when they will serve a greater purpose. The alcoves along the walls began to glow brighter, and Jonathan could see the sleeping children more clearly. They were all there, every Hargrove child who had vanished over the centuries, their bodies unchanged by the passage of time. But something was wrong with their faces. Their expressions were too peaceful, too empty, as though something essential had been hollowed out from within. They're not really alive, are they? Jonathan asked. Life, death, such crude distinctions. They exist in a state between states, sustained by my will and shaped by my needs. When the time comes, they will wake, and they will serve as the instruments of my return to the world above. Return. The hunger's form solidified slightly, taking on the appearance of a tall man in an old-fashioned coat. But where its face should have been was only darkness punctuated by stars that might have been eyes. Did you think I intended to remain buried beneath this crumbling manor forever? The compact was never about sacrifice for its own sake, Jonathan. It was about building an army. Each Hargrove child I claimed, each life I preserved, added to my eventual strength. And now, with the final heir finally within my grasp, the long preparation can come to an end. Jonathan backed away from the entity, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber stretched away into infinity in all directions, becoming a vast space that somehow still felt confining as a coffin. When I consume your essence, the compact will be complete. The hunger explained, following his retreat with leisurely steps. Your family's accumulated life force, stored within my collection for centuries, will finally be released. The children will wake, and they will walk forth into the world above as my harbingers. They will spread my influence to every corner of the earth, and soon all of humanity will know the ecstasy of true hunger. I won't let you, Jonathan said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Won't let me. The hunger laughed again, and this time the sound was joined by the laughter of the sleeping children, a chorus of innocent voices twisted into something horrible. My dear boy, you have no choice in the matter. The compact was signed in your ancestors' blood, sealed with generations of sacrifice, and ratified by your own return to this place. You belong to me now, as your family has always belonged to me. The entity reached out with something that might have been a hand, and Jonathan felt ice-cold fingers brush against his face. When they touched, his skin went numb, and he could feel something vital being drawn out of him. His warmth, his strength, his very life essence. Don't fight it. The hunger whispered. The children didn't fight. Your parents didn't fight. Even your ancestors in the end went willingly to their fate. Join them, Jonathan. Complete the compact. Let me finally claim what I am owed. But as the hunger's touch grew stronger, as Jonathan felt his consciousness beginning to fade, he heard something that gave him pause. Mixed in with the chorus of children's laughter was another sound, the voice of Mrs. Ashcombe calling his name from somewhere far above. She hadn't abandoned him after all. And if she was still free, if she was still fighting, then perhaps there was still hope. The question was whether he could hold on to that hope long enough to find a way to break a compact that had endured for centuries, or whether he would join the collection of dreamers whose empty smiles watched him from their eternal sleep. Mrs. Ashcombe's voice grew stronger, cutting through the hunger's hypnotic whispers like a blade through silk. Jonathan felt the entity's grip on his consciousness waver, just for a moment, but it was enough. He wrenched himself away from those ice-cold fingers and stumbled backward, gasping for air that tasted of ancient stone and preserved dreams. "She cannot save you," the hunger said, but for the first time since their encounter began, Jonathan detected something like uncertainty in its voice. "The compact is absolute. The bloodline debt must be paid." "Then why are you afraid of her?" Jonathan challenged, his strength returning as the hunger's influence weakened. The entity's form flickered, shifting between shapes like smoke in a wind. "I fear nothing. I am an appetite incarnate, older than your civilization, more enduring than your species." But Mrs. Ashcombe's voice continued to call, and with it came the sound of footsteps on the stone stairs. She was descending into the hunger's domain, carrying something that made the entity recoil like a physical blow. Margaret's journal, Jonathan breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You found it." Mrs. Ashcombe appeared at the chamber's entrance, her elderly frame silhouetted against the phosphorescent glow of the walls. In her hands she carried a leather-bound book that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sleeping children in their alcoves began to stir, their peaceful expressions flickering with something like awareness. "Margaret Hargrove, your father's sister," Mrs. Ashcombe said, her voice steady despite the terror that surrounded them. "She tried to break the compact 60 years ago. Everyone thought she failed, but she didn't. She found a way to wound it, to weaken the bonds that hold this thing together." The hunger hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a ruptured boiler. The girl was clever, I'll grant her that, but her solution required a sacrifice she wasn't prepared to make. "What kind of sacrifice?" Jonathan asked. Mrs. Ashcombe opened the journal, and its pages glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the chamber walls. "The compact can be broken, Master Jonathan, but only by reversing its terms. Instead of the family serving the hunger must be made to serve the family, but such a reversal requires—" She paused, her voice breaking. "It requires the willing sacrifice of the entire bloodline at once." "Suicide," Jonathan said, understanding. "Not suicide. Transformation." Margaret discovered that the hunger's power comes from its ability to preserve life in an unnatural state, to keep its victims suspended between life and death, feeding on their essence while maintaining their consciousness. But if that process is reversed, if the preserved life force is released all at once, the entity would be destroyed. Jonathan finished. Wounded, certainly, perhaps destroyed. Margaret wasn't certain. But she was certain of one thing: the children trapped in this chamber would be freed. Their souls would finally be released to whatever comes after life, and the hunger would lose the army it has been building for centuries. The entity had been listening to their conversation with growing agitation. Now it abandoned all pretense of civility, its form expanding to fill the chamber like a tide of living shadow. "You understand nothing," it roared, and its voice was no longer a whisper but a hurricane of sound that made the ancient stones tremble. "I am not some demon to be banished with prayers and holy water. I am a fundamental force, as necessary to existence as gravity or time. Remove me from the world, and you remove hunger itself, the drive to survive, to grow, to evolve. Humanity would simply lie down and wait for death to claim them. Maybe that would be better than what you're offering, Jonathan said, surprised by his own courage. Margaret's journal felt warm in Mrs. Ashcombe's hands, and Jonathan could see text appearing on its pages, words written in his aunt's careful script, but glowing as though traced in liquid fire. The ritual is complex, Mrs. Ashcombe breathed aloud, but not impossible. It requires the last living heir to willingly offer not just his own life, but the accumulated life force of his entire bloodline. Every Hargrove who ever lived, every drop of blood that carries the family legacy, must be freely given to break the bonds that sustain the entity. "I'll do it," Jonathan said, without hesitation. "You don't understand what you're offering." The hunger snarled. "Your death would be just the beginning. Every Hargrove who ever lived would be dragged screaming from whatever peace they found in the afterlife. Their souls would be consumed to fuel the breaking of the compact. Your family would face not just death, but absolute annihilation." Jonathan looked around the chamber at the sleeping children, their faces peaceful, despite their imprisonment. He thought of all the lives the hunger had claimed over the centuries, all the suffering it had caused in pursuit of its eventual freedom. The choice seemed clear. "They're already suffering," he said. "At least this way their suffering would have meaning." Mrs. Ashcombe continued reading from Margaret's journal. "The ritual must be performed at the heart of the hunger's power, using the very altar where the original compact was sealed. The heir must spill his blood willingly, calling upon every Hargrove soul to join him in defiance of the entity's will." "The altar," Jonathan said, looking around the chamber. "Where is it?" The hunger laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're standing on it, fool. This entire chamber is my altar, consecrated with centuries of Hargrove blood. Every stone beneath your feet is stained with the essence of your ancestors." As if responding to its words, the floor began to glow with veins of phosphorescent light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Jonathan could see the outline of symbols carved into the stone, the same incomprehensible geometries he'd seen on the walls, but larger, more complex, forming a pattern that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber. "The compact was sealed with your ancestors' blood," Mrs. Ashcombe said, still reading from the journal. "It can only be broken with the blood of his descendant freely given in defiance of the entity's will." The hunger surged forward, its form becoming more solid and threatening. "I will not allow this. The compact is mine by right. The bloodline is mine to consume." But as it reached for Jonathan, the sleeping children began to wake. Their eyes opened in unison, glowing with the same phosphorescent light as the chamber walls. When they spoke, their voices harmonized into a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. "We remember," they said. "We remember what we were before you took us. We remember the lives we should have lived, the futures you stole from us. We remember, and we choose freedom." The entity recoiled as though struck. "No, you are mine. You have always been mine." "We were never yours," the children replied. "We were borrowed, not owned, and now the debt comes due." Jonathan felt their strength flowing into him, the accumulated will of generations of Hargrove children who had been denied the chance to grow up, to live, to make their own choices. With their support, he stepped forward onto the altar at the chamber's center and drew the knife he'd taken from the kitchen. "For my family," he said, raising the blade. "For all the families yet to come, for the right to choose our own fate." The hunger screamed, a sound that shattered stone and made reality itself seem to bend, but it was too late. The ritual had begun, and for the first time in centuries, the hunger faced an enemy it could not simply consume. The question that remained was whether Jonathan's sacrifice would be enough to break bonds that had held for centuries, or whether the hunger's claim on the Hargrove bloodline was too strong to be severed by any act of mortal defiance. The knife felt impossibly heavy in Jonathan's hand, as though it were forged from the weight of all his family's sins. Around him, the chamber pulsed with unnatural life, the walls breathing with a rhythm that matched his terrified heartbeat, the floor glowing with veins of phosphorescent blood that had been spilled here across centuries of sacrifice. The hunger loomed over him, its form shifting between shapes that his mind could barely process. Sometimes it appeared as his ancestor Elias, young and ambitious and burning with unholy desire. Sometimes it wore the faces of the sleeping children, their features twisted into expressions of infinite hunger. But always, underneath whatever mask it chose to wear, Jonathan could sense its true nature: appetite without conscience, need without end, consumption without purpose beyond the act itself. You cannot break what was forged in darkness before your civilization learned to make fire, the hunger whispered, its voice coming from every direction at once. The compact is eternal, sealed in blood and shadow, and the fundamental forces that govern existence itself. But the children were stirring more actively now, their dream state beginning to fracture under the weight of collective will. Jonathan could hear their whispers joining into a chorus of defiance. We remember the taste of sunlight on our faces. We remember the feeling of grass beneath our feet. We remember what it meant to be alive, not just preserved. Margaret's journal in Mrs. Ashcombe's hands blazed with light, its pages turning of their own accord to reveal the final instructions for the ritual. The blood must be given freely, she read, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Not taken by force, not offered in despair, but given as an act of pure will. The heir must choose not just death, but obliteration, the complete erasure of his bloodline's claim to existence. I understand, Jonathan said, and found that he truly did. This wasn't just about ending his own life. It was about unmaking the very concept of the Hargrove lineage, erasing it so completely that the hunger would have nothing left to claim. He pressed the knife to his palm, feeling its edge part his skin. Blood welled up from the cut, falling in drops onto the altar stones. Where it touched, the phosphorescent veins flared brighter, and throughout the chamber the sleeping children began to stir more actively. The hunger recoiled from the altar, its form becoming less solid. Stop, it commanded, and for the first time its voice carried notes of genuine fear. You don't understand what you're destroying. Without the preservation of the bloodline, without the continuity of sacrifice, the natural order itself will collapse. The natural order? Jonathan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. You call this natural? Children stolen from their beds, families destroyed across generations, an entire bloodline enslaved to feed your appetite. If this is the natural order, then it deserves to collapse. He opened his palm wider, letting his blood flow more freely onto the altar. The phosphorescent veins drank it eagerly, spreading the crimson light throughout the chamber, like fire through dry kindling. And with each drop that fell, Jonathan felt something stirring, not just in himself, but in the spaces between life and death, where the souls of his ancestors waited. They came slowly at first, like figures emerging from fog. Elias Hargrove, but not as the hunger had preserved him in its memories. This was Elias as he had been before the compact, young and desperate but still possessed of a human soul. Behind him came others: Jonathan's father, gaunt and hollow-eyed from years of carrying the family burden, his mother, her face etched with the sorrow of understanding what fate awaited her son, Margaret herself, no longer the broken woman who had died trying to break the compact, but restored to the brilliant and defiant girl she had been. "We're here," his father said, his voice echoing strangely in the supernatural space. "We've all come to stand with you, son." "The compact bound us in life," Margaret added, her eyes blazing with centuries of accumulated rage. "But death has shown us the truth. We were never truly bound to this thing. We were only convinced that we were." The hunger writhed at the sight of the assembled Hargrove souls, its form becoming increasingly unstable. "Impossible. You are mine. I preserved you, I maintained your existence, I gave you purpose beyond the grave." You gave us nothing but suffering, Elias replied, and his voice carried the weight of 2 centuries of regret. I thought I was securing my family's future, but I only condemned them to an eternity of slavery. Now we choose freedom, even if that freedom means oblivion. Jonathan felt their collective will flowing into him, giving him strength for what came next. He raised the knife again, this time pressing it to his wrist where the blood flowed strongest. I freely give not just my life, but the essence of every Hargrove who came before and who might come after. I choose erasure over enslavement, extinction over servitude. The blade bit deep, and his life began to pour out onto the altar in a crimson flood. But this was not ordinary blood. It carried within it the accumulated essence of his entire bloodline, the spiritual DNA that connected him to every ancestor and every potential descendant. As it touched the altar stones, reality itself began to crack. The hunger screamed, a sound that shattered the barriers between dimensions. Its form began to collapse inward, losing cohesion as the fundamental forces that sustained it were stripped away. You don't know what you've done, it shrieked. Without me, without the hunger that drives all living things, your species will stagnate and die. Maybe, Jonathan admitted, his vision beginning to blur as his blood continued to flow, but they'll have the chance to choose their own fate. That's worth any risk. The children in their alcoves were fully awake now, their preservation beginning to fail as the hunger's power waned. But instead of fear, their faces showed only relief. They were finally truly dying, passing from their unnatural suspension into whatever came after life. Thank you, they whispered in unison, their voices already growing faint. Thank you for setting us free. The chamber began to collapse, not physically but spiritually, the accumulated weight of centuries of evil finally being released all at once. The hunger made one final attempt to maintain its hold, reaching out with tendrils of pure darkness toward Jonathan's bleeding form. But the assembled Hargrove souls stood between them, their combined will forming a barrier that the entity could not breach. The compact is broken, Margaret declared, her form already beginning to fade as the ritual reached its climax. The bloodline chooses oblivion over servitude. The debt is paid in full. Jonathan felt consciousness slipping away, but not into the darkness he had expected. Instead, there was light, warm and golden, and completely unlike the phosphorescent glow that had illuminated the hunger's domain. In that light, he saw his family waiting for him, no longer bound by ancient oaths or supernatural compulsions. They were free, all of them, and ready to face whatever came next together. The last thing he heard was Mrs. Ashcombe's voice calling his name from very far away. She would survive this, he realized. Someone had to witness what had happened here, to ensure that the truth of the Hargrove family's final sacrifice was not lost to history. As the chamber collapsed around them, and the hunger's screams faded into silence, Jonathan smiled. The price had been high, higher than any family should have to pay, but the debt was finally settled, and the future belonged to those who would choose their own destiny. Mrs. Ashcombe stood on the moor, a safe distance from the burning manor, and watched 2 centuries of accumulated sin turn to ash and smoke. The collapse had begun in the chamber far below, where the hunger's death throes had shattered the supernatural foundations that supported the estate. It spread upward through the sealed wing, the nursery where the children had slept their unnatural sleep, the study where Elias Hargrove had first penned his terrible bargain. The fire that consumed the Hargrove estate was not an ordinary flame. It burned with the same phosphorescent light that had once illuminated the hunger's domain, but transformed now into something cleansing rather than corrupting. Each room that succumbed to the blaze seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, as though the very stones were grateful to finally rest. The villagers had come, drawn by the pillar of strange light that rose from the manor like a beacon visible for miles across the Yorkshire moors. They stood in clusters at the edge of the estate grounds, whispering among themselves and crossing themselves against whatever unholy forces they imagined were finally being laid to rest. Mrs. Ashcombe heard fragments of their conversations carried on the wind. Always knew there was something wrong with that place. My grandmother said the Hargroves made a pact with the devil himself. Good riddance, I say. Maybe now the children will stop disappearing from the village. They were not entirely wrong, Mrs. Ashcombe reflected. The Hargroves had indeed made their pact with something infernal, and children had indeed disappeared over the years, though not as many as the villagers believed. Most of the hunger's victims had come from the bloodline itself, an endless harvest of family members whose only crime was being born into a legacy of supernatural servitude. As dawn broke over the smouldering ruins, Mrs. Ashcombe found herself the sole survivor of a drama that had played out across centuries. The Hargrove line was extinct. Jonathan's sacrifice had ensured that, and with it died the compact that had sustained the hunger for 200 years. She had felt the entity's death as a physical sensation, like the breaking of chains she hadn't realized were binding her own soul. The irony was not lost on her. She, the bastard descendant who had spent her life maintaining the very evil she despised, was the only one left to tell the story. Margaret's journal had crumbled to dust the moment Jonathan's blood touched the altar, its purpose finally fulfilled. The official records would show only that the last Hargrove heir had died in a house fire, taking with him the secrets of his family's inexplicable prosperity. But Mrs. Ashcombe would remember. She would carry the truth of what had happened in the chamber below, and she would ensure that it was never forgotten entirely. Not the details, perhaps. Those were too dangerous, too likely to inspire others to seek out similar bargains with forces beyond human understanding. But the core truth would survive, that sometimes the price of breaking a terrible legacy is the complete destruction of everything that legacy touched. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming not just the manor, but the very earth beneath it. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but a crater filled with ash that blew away on the moorland wind. The underground chambers, the altar where generations of sacrifices had been made, the alcoves where the hunger had stored its collection of preserved children, all of it was gone, as though it had never existed. Mrs. Ashcombe walked away from the ruins on the 4th day, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the memories that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She settled in a cottage in the nearest village, where she lived quietly for the remaining years granted to her. She never married, never had children. The Hargrove blood in her veins ensured that any offspring would carry the family's taint, and she refused to risk that burden falling on future generations. The villagers accepted her as one of their own, though they noticed certain oddities about the woman who had survived the Hargrove fire. She aged slowly, far more slowly than any mortal woman should. She sometimes spoke to empty rooms as though carrying on conversations with invisible companions. And on certain nights when the moon was dark and the wind howled across the moors, she could be seen walking to the place where the manor once stood, laying flowers on ground that would never again support a plant or tree. Years passed. The crater where the Hargrove estate had stood gradually filled with rainwater, becoming a small lake that reflected the Yorkshire sky with unnatural clarity. Local children were warned away from its shores, not because of any supernatural danger, but because Mrs. Ashcombe insisted that some places should be left to their peace. When she finally died, at an age that would have made her the oldest woman in England, Mrs. Ashcombe left behind a single document, a letter addressed to whoever might find it, sealed with wax and hidden in the foundation of her cottage. The letter told the true story of the Hargrove family's end, written in careful script that never wavered, despite the supernatural nature of its contents. "Let this serve as both warning and testament," the letter concluded. "The hunger that drives all living things is natural and necessary, but it can be corrupted by those who seek to transform appetite into power. The Hargroves learned this lesson too late, but they learned it completely. Their sacrifice broke chains that had bound them for centuries, and in doing so they chose freedom over survival, oblivion over enslavement. May their choice serve as an example to any who face similar temptations in the years to come. The letter was discovered decades later, during renovations to the cottage. By then, the story of the Hargrove fire had passed into local legend, simplified and mythologized, until it bore little resemblance to the truth. But occasionally, on nights when the wind carries voices across the moors, visitors to the area report hearing children's laughter coming from the lake that fills the crater where the manor once stood. It is not the hollow laughter of the Hunger's preserved collection, but the genuine joy of souls finally set free. The Hargrove children play now in whatever realm exists beyond death, their games no longer interrupted by ancient appetites or supernatural compulsions. They have found the peace that was denied to them in life, purchased at the ultimate price by the last heir who chose to end their bloodline rather than perpetuate its curse. And in the deep places beneath the lake, where the Hunger once held court, there is only silence. The entity that had fed on human essence for millennia is gone, unmade by an act of willing self-destruction that broke the fundamental bonds holding it to existence. Its underground kingdom has collapsed into dust and memory, leaving no trace of the horror that once dwelt there. But Mrs. Ashcombe's final question echoes still across the Yorkshire moors, carried on the wind to anyone willing to listen. Did Jonathan truly destroy the Hunger completely, or did he merely wound it, driving it deeper underground to wait for some future family, desperate enough to make their own bargain with forces beyond human understanding? The lake keeps its secrets, reflecting only sky and clouds and the occasional flight of birds across the moorland. But sometimes, in its deepest parts, bubbles rise to the surface without apparent cause. And sometimes, those who stare too long into its crystalline depths report seeing lights moving far below, lights that pulse with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. The Hargrove legacy ended, their debt paid in full. But appetite itself is eternal, and there are always those willing to trade their souls for prosperity. Perhaps the Hunger truly died in that phosphorescent chamber beneath the earth. Or perhaps it merely sleeps, dreaming hungry dreams and waiting for the next desperate soul to stumble upon its resting place. Only time will tell which version of the story is true. Until then, the lake reflects the sky, the wind carries whispers across the moors, and somewhere in the spaces between life and death, the Hargrove children play their eternal games, finally free from the burden of their bloodline's terrible legacy. The last debt has been paid. The question that remains is whether payment will be enough to ensure that no such debt is ever incurred again,